The Mississippi sun hung heavy in the late afternoon sky, stretching long shadows across cracked sidewalks. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant sizzle of barbecue from someone's backyard. It was the kind of afternoon where time seemed to slow, where people sat on their porches sipping sweet tea, watching the world go by. Joseph Joe Wallace shuffled down Cedar Grove Avenue, his grip firm around a brown paper bag filled with groceries. His other hand clutched the smooth, time-worn handle of his wooden cane, a relic of both his past and the war wounds that had never quite healed. Each step was deliberate, his knees stiff but steady. At 74 years old, Joe had seen this neighborhood change. He had moved here decades ago, back when the streets were quieter, the community tighter. He'd watched kids grow up, businesses come and go. He was a familiar face. The kind old man who fixed broken radios for the neighbors, who offered a wave to the mailman and a nod to the young boys riding their bikes past his house. But he also knew that respect wasn't something you could wear like a badge, not in the eyes of certain people. The low hum of an approaching engine made Joe glance over his shoulder. A black and white police cruiser had slowed down behind him, crawling at an unsettling pace. He exhaled sharply, already feeling that old, familiar weight settle in his chest. Not again. The Jackson Police Department logo was stamped on the side of the cruiser, the letters gleaming under the sun. Behind the wheel sat Officer Kyle Matthews, his buzz cut stark against his pale skin, mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes. Joe kept walking, adjusting his bag, willing the moment to pass. The moment did not pass. The police car inched forward, matching his pace. Joe could feel Kyle watching him, measuring him. Then came the sound. A sharp chirp of the siren, slicing through the humid afternoon air. Joe stopped walking. He didn't turn around immediately. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly around the handle of his cane. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he knew exactly how this would go. A voice followed the siren, clipped and authoritative. "Hey, stop right there." Joe inhaled deeply. This again. He turned slowly, his face calm, his eyes steady. Kyle had already stepped out of the cruiser, his stance firm, one hand resting casually on his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. Joe had seen men like him before. Different decade, different uniform, same damn story. And just like that, the quiet afternoon was gone. It was starting. Again, Joe Wallace stood still, gripping his cane as the weight of the moment settled over him. The afternoon heat pressed against his skin, but it wasn't the sun making him sweat. It was the familiar tension creeping into his chest. Officer Kyle Matthews stepped forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. The mirrored sunglasses reflected the street, making it impossible to read his eyes, but Joe didn't need to. He'd seen that stance before. The squared shoulders, the slight puff of the chest, the way Kyle's hand hovered near his belt. It was a posture of control, of dominance. Kyle stopped just a step too close. "What are you doing around here?" His voice was flat, authoritative. Joe tightened his grip on his cane. Walking home, Kyle tilted his head slightly. "That's so." He let his gaze travel over Joe's faded work boots, the old jeans, the worn Vietnam veteran cap pulled low over his silver hair. Joe knew what Kyle saw. Not a man who had spent his life fixing engines, raising a family, surviving wars both overseas and at home. Not a man who had built this neighborhood, watched it change, seen kids grow into adults. Kyle didn't see history. He saw a question mark. "You live around here?" Kyle pressed. Joe exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "I've lived here longer than you've been alive, son." He nodded toward the houses up the block. 2 streets over. Kyle let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "That right? You got idea on you." Joe's stomach clenched. His wallet was on the He'd taken it out earlier to check some old VA paperwork and had forgotten to slip it back into his pocket before heading out. It was a small mistake, one he never thought would matter, until now. Joe patted his chest, knowing the answer but checking anyway. Kyle's smirk deepened. Convenient. Joe met his gaze. I can tell you my address. You can check. Kyle ignored that. Hands out of your pockets. Joe sighed. Ain't got no pockets. He lifted his arm slightly, showing his open palms. Kyle's smirk twitched, annoyed that Joe wasn't rattled. Then the rookie cop took a step closer. Too close. Joe could smell his cologne, the faint scent of leather from his duty belt. Kyle wanted him to feel small. But Joe had seen men with real power before. This kid, he wasn't one of them. Kyle lifted his radio, pressing the mic. Dispatch, I've got a suspicious individual on Cedar Grove. Older black male, possibly loitering. Claims he lives in the area, requesting backup. Joe's jaw locked. This wasn't about loitering. This wasn't about ID. This was about control. Kyle knew exactly what he was doing. And Joe knew this wasn't going to end quickly. Joe Wallace stood still, his grip tightening around the handle of his cane. The heat of the afternoon pressed heavy against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the tension hanging thick in the air. Kyle Matthews had called for backup. Joe had seen this before, too many times. A simple stop would turn into a scene. A scene would turn into an excuse, and an excuse could turn into something much worse. The distant sound of sirens grew louder. Kyle didn't take his eyes off Joe. His stance was still rigid, still ready, still clinging to control. Joe's voice was calm but firm. You're making a mistake. Kyle smirked. That right? Joe nodded toward the houses nearby. You don't need backup. Knock on any door here, they'll tell you exactly who I am. Kyle ignored him. He wanted this to go his way. He needed it to. The first squad car pulled up, tires grinding against the pavement. Two officers stepped out, Sergeant Mark Daniels and Officer Kevin Torres. Joe recognized Daniels. He had seen him around before. A man who had been on the force long enough to know when something didn't sit right. Torres was younger, quieter, his eyes flicking between Joe and Kyle, picking up on the tension. Daniels sighed, stepping forward. What's going on here? Kyle squared his shoulders. Suspicious individual, claims he lives in the area, but doesn't have ID. Daniels glanced at Joe, then back at Kyle. And... Kyle's jaw tensed. He won't comply. Joe let out a sharp exhale. Won't comply. He shook his head. I told you my address. I told you to ask a neighbor. Hell, I even showed you my hands. Daniels hesitated. Joe saw it. He wasn't fully buying what Kyle was selling. Daniels turned to Joe. Sir, you live around here? Joe locked eyes with him. I already told him. Been here since 1983. Daniels studied him for a long second, then glanced at Torres. Run his name. Kyle's face twitched. Joe knew why. He was losing control. Kyle stepped in closer, voice dropping just enough to feel like a threat. Turn around. Joe's shoulders squared. For what? Kyle's hand moved to his belt, his fingers brushing against his cuffs. That was the shift. Joe felt it. The moment things turned from inconvenience to danger. Torres shifted uncomfortably. Daniels took a small step forward. Joe knew exactly where this was going. And he knew he didn't have much time. The air between them was thick, charged like the moments before a storm. Joe Wallace knew this was the turning point. He had a choice. He could resist, which would give Kyle Matthews the excuse he was itching for. Or he could comply, let the cuffs tighten around his wrists like a lesson he had already learned too many times before. Neither option sat right with him. Kyle's fingers twitched near his belt. The cuffs. Not the gun, not yet. The moment stretched, an unspoken dare between them. Then Kyle moved. His hand clamped around Joe's forearm, firm, deliberate, not violent, not yet, but hard enough to make it clear that he wasn't asking any more. Joe felt the weight of it all, the history, the exhaustion, the anger that had been swallowing men like him whole for generations. No, not today. Joe's muscles tensed. His other hand, the one gripping his cane, tightened around the worn wood. Turn around. Kyle's voice was sharper now, more impatient. Joe's jaw locked. You don't want to do this. Kyle scoffed. Oh yeah, and why's that? Joe took a breath, steady and slow. Because I got a heart condition. Kyle's grip didn't loosen. Joe's chest was starting to tighten, not just from frustration, but from something deeper, something real. He clenched his teeth. I can't breathe right now. Kyle didn't care. He yanked harder. Joe stumbled, his knee nearly buckling under him. His cane slipped from his grasp, hitting the pavement with a hollow clatter. Daniels took a half step forward. Kyle, hold up. Kyle ignored him. Stop resisting. Joe wasn't resisting. He was just trying to stand. His breath came short, uneven. The world started to blur at the edges. The grocery bag slipped from his fingers, oranges spilling onto the pavement, rolling in lazy circles. Then, a voice. Not loud, but sharp, cutting through the scene like a blade. Let him go. Kyle froze. Joe didn't need to look to know everything had just changed. The storm had arrived. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something deeper than just tension. Kyle Matthews still had his hand on Joe Wallace's arm, but something in the air had shifted. Joe didn't have to look to know who had spoken. Michael Wallace. His son. The voice carried no anger, no desperation, just a weight that made everyone stop. Kyle turned first, his grip still firm on Joe, his expression flickering between arrogance and hesitation. So step back. This doesn't concern you. Michael didn't move. He stood just a few feet away, his stance relaxed but deliberate. He wasn't in uniform, no badge on his chest, no gun on his hip. Just a plain black t-shirt stretched over broad shoulders and jeans that told no story of who he was, but the way he carried himself did. Kyle sized him up, trying to figure out if he was a threat. He had no idea. Michael's voice was level. Let go of my father. Kyle scoffed, still gripping Joe's arm. I don't know who you think you are, but interfering with police business is a crime. Michael didn't blink. I'm not interfering, I'm correcting a mistake. Kyle's fingers twitched. He wasn't used to this. Someone standing in front of him who wasn't afraid, who wasn't backing down. Sergeant Mark Daniels took a cautious step forward. Kyle, maybe we should... Kyle cut him off. We're in the middle of an investigation. Michael exhaled, slow and measured. An investigation? Into what? A man walking home? No answer. Michael's gaze locked onto Kyle's. Run his name. Kyle's jaw clenched. That's not how this works. Michael took a slow step forward. Then let me tell you how this is going to work. You're going to run his name. You're going to confirm what he's already told you, and then you're going to let him go. Or we can make this a much bigger problem for you. Kyle bristled. Are you threatening me? Michael's voice dropped just slightly. No. I'm saving you. Kyle swallowed. For the first time, he felt out of control. Daniels glanced at Michael, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he turned to Torres, the younger officer. Run the name. Kyle stiffened. Are you serious? But Torres had already lifted his radio. Dispatch, name check. Joseph Wallace, 74, resident of Cedar Grove. The moment stretched. Joe exhaled, watching Kyle's grip weaken ever so slightly. Michael took one last step forward, voice calm, unshaken. You're done here. And Kyle knew it. The radio crackled. Joseph Wallace, 74 years old, long-time resident, no warrants, no record, no reason for detainment. The words landed like a hammer. For a long, stretched moment, nobody moved. Joe exhaled, steady, watching Kyle Matthews process what had just happened. Kyle had lost. But losing wasn't something men like him accepted easily. His fingers were still curled around Joe's wrist, the last bit of his authority clinging to a situation slipping through his hands. His jaw tightened, his pride warring with reality. Michael Wallace took another slow step forward. You heard them. Let him go. Kyle's eyes flicked between Michael, Joe, and Sergeant Daniels. He was looking for someone, anyone, to back him up. But no one did. Daniels adjusted his stance, his silence speaking louder than words. Torres looked down, unwilling to meet Kyle's gaze. Kyle swallowed. His grip faltered. Then, finally, he let go. Joe pulled his arm back, rolling his shoulder, his expression unreadable. He didn't thank Kyle, because this wasn't a favor. Michael's eyes never left Kyle's. Next time, be sure before you put your hands on someone. Kyle scoffed, shaking his head, his pride too thick to admit he had been wrong. You think you won something today? His voice was lower now, quieter, but still laced with defiance. Michael gave him nothing, just a long, quiet look before turning back to his father. Come on, Pop. Joe bent down, picking up his cane, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He just stood. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Daniels exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, then looked at Kyle. We're done here. It wasn't a suggestion. Kyle's jaw locked, but he didn't argue. Joe and Michael turned and started walking, leaving behind the squad cars, the stairs, the tension. Kyle didn't call after them, because deep down he knew he had just dodged a bullet. The air felt different as Joe and Michael walked away. The tension still lingered, but with every step it loosened its grip. Joe's fingers tightened slightly around his cane. His breathing had steadied, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. Not completely. Michael walked beside him, silent at first. He didn't rush his father, didn't ask if he was okay, because he already knew the answer. This wasn't the first time, and deep down Joe knew it wouldn't be the last. Michael reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone. Joe eyed him. Who are you calling? Michael didn't answer immediately. He scrolled through his contacts, then pressed a number. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, authoritative, Commander. Michael's voice was steady. I need an incident report pulled from Jackson PD. Today's date, Cedar Grove Avenue. The person on the other end didn't ask why. They just said, give me 10 minutes. Michael ended the call. Joe sighed, shaking his head. Son, you can't fight every battle. Michael stopped walking. You taught me better than that. Joe didn't reply, because he had. By nightfall, Kyle Matthews' body cam footage had been flagged. By the next morning, an internal review had begun. Within a week, Kyle was suspended, and within a month he was gone. The department never called it what it was. They never admitted the real reason. They never did. But the damage was done. Kyle had made a mistake, one that reached the wrong people. Joe never asked for details, never asked who Michael had called. All he knew was that for the first time in a long time, he walked to the store the next week without looking over his shoulder. And that was enough. Some battles are fought with fists, some with fire, but others are fought with patience, with strategy. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest, is the one who knows exactly when to strike. Respect is not a request, it's a requirement. And if you can't give it, don't be surprised when the world makes you pay the price. The lesson. Silence never changed anything. This wasn't just about one traffic stop. It wasn't just about one officer with a badge and too much to prove. It was about a system, about how power is wielded and about who gets to walk freely without question and who doesn't. Joe Wallace had lived long enough to know that some things don't change overnight. But Michael Wallace had lived long enough to know that doesn't mean you don't fight. Respect isn't optional. It's not something you grant when it's convenient. It's a requirement. And when it's denied, when it's stripped away under the weight of a uniform, a badge, or a misplaced sense of authority, there will always be a reckoning. Because sooner or later you push the wrong man. And when that happens, there won't be a badge big enough to protect you. Now it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Joe's position? Or Michael's? Let's talk about it. If you believe that respect should never be optional, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because stories like these need to be heard. And if you agree that silence never changed anything, share this story. Because the world doesn't change by watching. It changes by speaking up.